The 4th of February 2016. Night had fallen over Dhaka. Inside the headquarters of Bangladesh Bank, a few office lights were still on. The air conditioners hummed quietly. The printers sat idle. Long hallways glowed beneath the cold white light of a workday coming to an end. There were no sirens, no shattered glass, no vaults being cut open, no masked robbers bursting through the front doors. Everything looked like an ordinary night. But somewhere inside the bank's systems, invisible doors were beginning to open. No one ran. No one screamed. No one realized that, at that very moment, $951 million was preparing to leave one of the world's central banks. Not in armored trucks, not at gunpoint, but through a series of commands sent in complete silence. More than 12,000 kilometers away, New York. Inside the systems of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a series of payment requests began to appear. One transfer, then another, then another. Soon, dozens more followed. A total of $951 million was being requested from Bangladesh Bank's account. But on the screen, nothing looked like a robbery. No flashing red alerts. No clumsy forged signatures. No frantic transactions that looked like someone trying to flee. Every payment order carried a valid digital signature. Every request originated from the correct bank. Every message traveled through the SWIFT network exactly as it was supposed to. Every instruction was written in the language banks use to communicate with one another every single day. On paper, everything looked perfectly normal. It was like watching a convoy of armored trucks drive through the bank's gates with the proper permits, the correct license plates, and right on schedule. There was only one problem. No one at Bangladesh Bank had ever authorized those trucks to leave. The attackers didn't crack open the vault. They convinced the system that the bank itself had opened it. The strange part was, no one inside the bank knew it was happening. The employees who should have seen every transaction leaving the system saw nothing at all. The printer responsible for producing the SWIFT transaction logs suddenly fell silent. No gears turning. No paper feeding through. Not a single transaction was printed. It was as if the only guard standing outside the vault had suddenly been gagged. But inside that room, no one suspected a robbery. They assumed the printer had malfunctioned. Just a minor technical problem. Something that could be fixed later. So they waited. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the payment orders kept moving. One after another. Silent. Precise. Like armored trucks quietly rolling through an open gate, with no one there to stop them. Meanwhile, the money kept moving. From New York, to Sri Lanka, to the Philippines, then into a network of accounts that had been quietly prepared months in advance. Each account was a waypoint. Each transfer closed another door behind it. And once the money passed through enough layers, it no longer looked like stolen money. It became nothing more than numbers disappearing into the dark. But then, a tiny detail emerged. So small, it was almost invisible. It wasn't a firewall. It wasn't antivirus software. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar artificial intelligence system. It was a typo. Just one misspelled word. In the name of a recipient organization in Sri Lanka, the word foundation had been typed as Foundation. A bank employee noticed it, paused, and requested a review. That single spelling mistake stopped a $20 million transfer before the money could disappear. The additional scrutiny that followed prevented most of the remaining transfers from going through. If that word had been spelled correctly, if no one had stopped to look twice, nearly $1 billion might have quietly vanished from Bangladesh Bank's account. But the most frightening part wasn't the typo. It was the question hiding behind the entire heist. How did an invisible group of attackers convince one of the world's central banks to send away nearly $1 billion? Without a gun, without breaking into a vault, without ever setting foot inside the building? To answer that question, we have to go back 4 months. A mysterious piece of software quietly appeared inside Bangladesh Bank's network. No one saw who put it there. No security camera captured a face. No security guard noticed a stranger. Investigators believe the initial breach likely began with a carefully crafted phishing email, convincing enough to persuade someone to open an attachment or click a link. An action performed thousands of times every day in offices around the world. But this time, the moment that link was clicked, malware quietly embedded itself inside the bank's internal network. It made no noise. It didn't crash computers. It didn't lock files and demand a ransom. It simply stayed there, like a parasite that doesn't rush to kill its host, because it first needs to understand how the body works. The people behind the attack watched how employees did their jobs, when they logged in, how departments communicated, how a payment order was created, who entered the transaction, who had the authority to approve it, where incoming confirmations from overseas were reviewed, how transaction logs were recorded. They weren't just collecting passwords, they were collecting habits. Because passwords can be changed, but an organization's habits usually last much longer. For months, the intruders learned how to blend into the bank's normal operations. Their goal wasn't to stop the system from working. Their goal was to make sure it kept working, just for a different master. To do that, they first had to learn the most important language inside the building, the language of Swift. Swift doesn't store money. It carries messages. It is the global messaging network that financial institutions use to communicate with one another. When one bank wants another bank to move money, it sends a payment message in a standardized format. Every field has a specific place. Every code has a specific meaning. Every message must contain the proper authentication. If everything matches, the receiving system has every reason to believe the instruction is legitimate. Bangladesh Bank held part of its foreign currency reserves at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. To access those funds, the bank in Dhaka had to send payment instructions to New York. Under normal circumstances, the process resembles a conversation between two institutions that have trusted each other for years. Bangladesh sends the instruction. New York receives it. Correspondent banks process the payment. The money arrives at its intended destination. The attackers understood that the hardest target wasn't the Federal Reserve, nor was it the SWIFT network itself. The smarter approach was to create a fraudulent instruction that spoke perfect grammar. They studied how Bangladesh Bank formatted its SWIFT messages, how beneficiary names were written, how account numbers were entered, how large transfers were divided into multiple payment orders, how digital signatures authenticated the sender. Every detail was carefully memorized, like a master forger who doesn't simply copy a signature, but learns the pressure of the pen, the spacing between each letter, even the natural pauses in the genuine writer's hand. By the time they were finished, the fake payment messages no longer looked like they came from an outsider. They followed the correct format, contained valid authentication, traveled through the proper communication channels. They didn't try to shout over the fence. They spoke in the bank's own voice. But a payment instruction means nothing unless someone is waiting to receive it. So while one part of the operation quietly observed Dhaka, another part of the plan was already being built in the Philippines. Beginning in 2015, a number of bank accounts were opened at a branch of Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation, RCBC, on Jupiter Street in Makati, Philippines. The accounts were opened under identities that appeared perfectly ordinary. Once established, they remained almost completely inactive. No large deposits, no unusual transaction history, no obvious reason for compliance officers to ask questions. They were like remote airstrips built far from civilization. For months, no aircraft ever landed. But the runway lights were already in place. The coordinates had already been marked, and the people who planned to use them knew exactly when they would arrive. Another receiving point was quietly prepared in Sri Lanka. The operation was never just about moving money out of New York. It was about everything that happened afterward. Stolen money can't sit at its first destination for very long. The longer it stays still, the easier it is to freeze. So the moment it landed, it had to move again, converted into another currency, broken into smaller pieces, passed through intermediary companies, blended into legitimate financial activity. With every step, its original source became harder to trace. The attackers had prepared the receiving network long before they finished forging the payment instructions. That alone reveals something important. This wasn't an opportunistic crime. It was an operation built layer by layer. But one critical piece was still missing. Not the malware, not the bank accounts, the calendar. The 4th of February 2016 fell on a Thursday. In Bangladesh, the work week was entering its final hours. Friday and Saturday marked the country's weekend. As employees in Dhaka left their offices, New York was still open for business. Payment instructions sent from Bangladesh could still be received and processed in the United States. Then the weekend reached New York. And almost immediately afterward, the Philippines was preparing to enter the Lunar New Year holiday. 3 countries, 3 different calendars, 3 different schedules. They never stopped working at the same time. But that mismatch created a dangerous window. When New York sent questions back to Bangladesh, the people who needed to answer had already gone home. When Bangladesh finally discovered something was wrong, institutions on the other end of the transaction were already heading into the weekend. And when requests to freeze the funds reached the Philippines, the banks or the departments responsible were no longer operating at full capacity. The attackers didn't need to stop the clock. They only needed to make sure each clock was telling a different day. The delay wasn't caused by a broken system. It was created by weekends, time zones, and public holidays. Things that seemed completely ordinary, but placed in exactly the right order. They became another layer of protection. Every passing hour gave the money more time to leave the first destination, more time to be converted into different currencies, more time for the trail to scatter. The attackers had chosen the perfect moment. Now they needed to make sure that, during those critical first hours, no one in Dhaka could see what was happening. Bangladesh Bank relied on a dedicated printer to produce hard copies of SWIFT messages and transaction logs. Every printout was another layer of verification. An employee could see a payment instruction that had just been sent, spot an unusually large amount, recognize a beneficiary that had never appeared before, or notice a suspicious response from a foreign bank. To the attackers, that printer wasn't just another office device. It was the point where the digital world left behind physical evidence. So the malware was designed to go deeper into the SWIFT environment. It didn't just help generate and transmit fraudulent payment instructions. It also manipulated what the system revealed afterward. Some records were hidden. Some responses never appeared as they normally would. The printing of transaction logs was quietly disrupted. Rather than destroying the evidence after the crime, the attackers made sure the evidence never appeared when it mattered most. That distinction is critical. A burned file cabinet would trigger panic. A printer that suddenly stops working gets a call to IT. And that's exactly what happened. Employees noticed the printer had gone silent. They assumed it was a hardware failure, a network issue, a routine technical problem that could be fixed once the IT staff returned. No one imagined that while they were waiting for a single sheet of paper, a plot to steal nearly $1 billion was already underway. On the night of February 4th, the attackers shifted from observation to action. swift messages began leaving Bangladesh Bank. In total, 35 payment instructions were sent to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Together, they requested $951 million. The instructions weren't carelessly written. They carried none of the obvious signs of an amateur fraud. Every message used Bangladesh Bank's legitimate authentication. Every message traveled through the same channels used by legitimate international transfers. Inside New York, the system didn't see a robber. It saw a customer requesting access to its own money. But the size and destinations of several transfers began to raise questions. Some payments were unusually large. Some beneficiaries prompted intermediary banks to request clarification. Others were flagged by internal controls. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York sent multiple verification requests back to Dhaka. But Bangladesh Bank didn't respond in time. The work week had already ended. The printer wasn't producing transaction logs. And the people who needed to see those questions hadn't yet realized how urgent they were. As a result, most of the payment orders were never executed. Roughly $850 million remained safely in the account. But 5 transfers made it through. One payment worth $20 million was sent to Sri Lanka. 4 more, totaling $81 million, were sent to the Philippines. The attempt to steal nearly $1 billion had largely failed. Yet $101 million still escaped the account. And it was a tiny mistake in just one of those payment instructions that prevented the losses from becoming even greater. The payment destined for Sri Lanka was addressed to an organization called Shalika Foundation. But inside the SWIFT message, the word foundation had been misspelled as foundation. One letter. In an operation involving thousands of technical details, it seemed almost insignificant. But it was enough to catch someone's attention. A bank employee paused the transaction and requested additional verification. The $20 million transfer was put on hold. It was eventually recovered. An operation that had been planned for months had accounted for malware, the SWIFT network, time zones, holiday schedules, receiving accounts. But in the end, a single spelling mistake became the grain of sand that jammed the gears. It didn't stop the entire heist, but it delayed one branch of the operation just long enough for someone to notice. If that word had been spelled correctly, another $20 million might have disappeared. In the Philippines, however, no such mistake appeared at the critical moment. The $81 million reached Makati, and almost immediately, it began to change shape. After the funds were credited to the RCBC accounts, they were routed through intermediary companies and converted from US dollars into Philippine pesos. From there, a large portion of the money flowed into casinos. Casinos provided an ideal environment for obscuring the origin of funds. Cash could be exchanged for chips. Chips could be transferred to someone else, placed on gaming tables, used for a small amount of gambling, then converted back into cash or casino checks. With each step, the money's original trail became harder to follow. When $1 million sits in a bank account, it has a sender, a recipient, a payment purpose. But once that same money is absorbed into casino operations, it becomes part of a massive stream of wagers, winnings, losses, and chip exchanges moving through the gaming floor every day. At the time, casinos in the Philippines were not fully covered by the country's anti-money laundering framework in the same way banks were. That legal gap became a critical weakness. The people moving the money didn't need to destroy every piece of evidence. They only needed to move it somewhere. The evidence became much harder to read. Like writing a single line of ink onto a page already covered with thousands of others. By the time Bangladesh Bank sent requests to freeze the funds, most of the $81 million was no longer sitting in the original recipient accounts. It had already been dispersed through multiple layers of intermediaries. Some of the money was eventually recovered, but most of it never found its way back to Bangladesh Bank. When the printer finally came back to life, it began printing everything that had been hidden: transaction records, Responses from New York. Verification requests. The first signs that the bank's reserve account had been used without genuine authorization. One page landed in the output tray. Then another. Then another. The stack grew into a report of a crime that had already happened. Employees stared at the numbers. $951 million had been requested. $101 million had actually left the account. Only then did Bangladesh Bank begin urgently contacting the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, SWIFT, the recipient banks, and authorities in the countries involved. But a response can only begin once the truth becomes visible. And the truth arrived too late. Phone calls were made while the money was still moving from account to account. Freeze requests were sent after part of the funds had already left the original recipient banks. Investigators found themselves racing from behind. The robbery was no longer unfolding. It had become a web that needed to be unraveled. The first question was obvious. Where is the money? But it wasn't long before a much larger question emerged. Who had the knowledge, the patience, and the capability to put all of this together? After the heist, cybersecurity experts began analyzing the malware discovered inside Bangladesh Bank systems. Computer code has no face, but the person who writes it still leaves behind a style, the way functions are organized, the way files are handled, the way activity is concealed, the fragments of code that get reused, the programming mistakes that appear again and again. Analysts compared those traits with malware from earlier operations. Slowly, the similarities began to emerge. Some of the tools and techniques resembled malicious code used in the 2014 attack on Sony Pictures. The evidence also aligned with other financial campaigns targeting banks across multiple countries. The investigation began pointing toward the Lazarus Group, a name used by cybersecurity researchers to describe a network of hackers linked to the North Korean government. The branch focused on financial operations is often referred to as APT-38. Their mission wasn't limited to stealing intelligence. It wasn't limited to destroying computer systems. It also involved stealing foreign currency from financial institutions around the world. According to charges later announced by the U.S. Department of Justice, North Korean programmers including Park Jin-hyuk, John Chang-hyuk, and Kim Il were allegedly connected to a broader campaign involving attacks against banks and other targets. But the public record does not identify exactly who created or transmitted each individual payment order in the Bangladesh Bank heist. There is no single face that can be placed on a wanted poster for the entire operation, because Lazarus doesn't operate like a lone bank robber. An operation like the Bangladesh Bank heist required many different roles. Someone to find a way inside. Someone to develop the malware. Someone to study the SWIFT environment. Someone to prepare the receiving accounts. Someone to coordinate with intermediaries in the Philippines. Someone to convert, move, and disperse the stolen funds. Each link in the chain only needed to understand its own assignment. The person writing the malware didn't necessarily need to meet the person opening the bank accounts. The person receiving the money didn't necessarily know who had breached Bangladesh Bank. That separation made the entire operation much harder to see as a single machine. According to U.S. allegations, members of the Lazarus Group operated under the direction of North Korea's Reconnaissance General Bureau, Pyongyang's military intelligence agency. If that assessment is correct, then this wasn't merely a cyber robbery. It was an operation designed to generate foreign currency for an isolated nation under extensive international sanctions. Keyboards became financial weapons. Malware became a way to reach into national reserves. The global banking system became a battlefield with no clearly defined borders. In the previous century, taking another country's assets might have required deploying troops, blockading ports, or physically seizing a treasury. In the Bangladesh Bank heist, the people allegedly behind the operation never needed to leave their workplaces. They studied procedures, forged messages, exploited holiday schedules, and waited for the financial system to carry out the instructions placed in front of it. The heist did not succeed completely. Most of the $951 million was blocked. The $20 million sent toward Sri Lanka was recovered. Some of the money routed through the Philippines was eventually returned, but most of the $81 million still disappeared. More importantly, the operation proved something. A bank can protect its front entrance, reinforce its vault, hire armed security. But if an attacker learns how the organization communicates, approves transactions, and decides what to trust, they don't need to defeat the entire system. They only need to make the system do exactly what it was designed to do for the wrong person. After the Bangladesh Bank Heist, the financial world didn't just lose money. It lost its innocence. Before then, many people still believed that large systems would somehow know how to protect themselves. Central banks, international payment networks, digital signatures, verification procedures, layers of control that seemed thick enough to stop a robbery before it could go very far. But February 2016 proved otherwise. The larger the system, the more institutions involved, the more time zones, holidays, intermediary banks, and interconnected procedures, the more blind spots appear between the links. Dhaka saw one piece. New York saw another. Manila saw another. No one saw the entire picture early enough. And in global finance, a delay of a few hours is not merely a delay. It can be the difference between a transaction being stopped and tens of millions of dollars disappearing. The first lesson is that security cannot end at the borders of a single institution. An alert in Bangladesh may be an emergency signal for New York. An unusual account in the Philippines may be the final destination of an attack that began months earlier. A holiday, an unread email, a delayed response. Any one of them can become a gap through which money escapes. That is why the financial system needs more than powerful technology. It needs fast reflexes, cross-border coordination, verification channels that do not depend on normal business hours, and the assumption that attackers will choose the exact moment when people are least prepared to respond. The second lesson is this: valid does not mean safe. A message can contain the correct format, the correct codes, the correct routing, the correct signature, and still be fundamentally fraudulent. A large transaction should not be trusted simply because it resembles every other transaction. It must be compared against behavioral history, the beneficiary, the payment purpose, the size of the transfer, the time it was submitted, and verification responses from multiple independent channels. In modern finance, the most dangerous thing is not always the thing that looks wrong. Sometimes, it is the thing that looks almost too perfect. The third lesson concerns access. Systems connected to SWIFT cannot be treated like ordinary office software. Privileged accounts must be tightly restricted. Sensitive instructions must be logged in real time. Logs must have independent backups. Alerts must reach more than one person. And any monitoring system that suddenly goes silent must be treated as a warning sign, not as a minor technical malfunction. Because in the Bangladesh Bank Heist, the danger did not arrive with an explosion. It arrived in silence. The fourth lesson is that what happens after the money leaves matters just as much as the moment it is sent. A cyber heist does not end when funds leave the first account. It ends when the money has been laundered, divided, transformed, and converted into assets that are difficult to trace. Newly opened accounts, intermediary companies, currency exchanges, casinos, loosely regulated jurisdictions. These are not secondary details. They are the rest of the escape route. If a bank only watches the point where the money leaves, the pursuit has already begun too late. But the deepest lesson is colder still. The Bangladesh Bank Heist was not merely a story about malware, not merely a spelling mistake, not merely the Lazarus Group. It was the story of a system being persuaded to act against itself, not through violence, not through chaos, but through imitation, precise enough to be believed. A fraudulent message wearing the appearance of a legitimate instruction, an illegal transfer traveling along legal rails, a lie written in the perfect grammar of a bank. And when that lie looked real enough, the system did not resist it. The system processed it. That is what makes this heist more frightening than the amount of money that was lost. It showed that in the 21st century, banks are not attacked only by breaking through their defenses. Sometimes, they are attacked by studying those defenses until they can be copied, learning the procedures, learning the timing, learning how approvals work, learning how an institution speaks to the world, then using that same language to betray it. Most of the $951 million was stopped. Some of the money was recovered, but the disappearance of $81 million was enough to leave a scar, not only on Bangladesh Bank, but across the entire global financial system. After the heist, the question was no longer simply, has someone broken into the system? It became, if they have been inside long enough to understand us, will we recognize the moment they begin impersonating us? That is the real question left behind by the Bangladesh Bank Heist. Not where the money went, not who pressed the button, but why a system built to protect trust could be defeated by trust itself. Because in the end, money can be traced, accounts can be frozen, software can be patched, procedures can be rewritten. But once trust has been successfully forged, the greatest damage is not found in the amount that was stolen. It is found in the moment the system realizes it was never forced. It followed the instructions on its own.